Stop. Before you press play on another video, before you scroll past this, I need you to understand something critical. What you about to hear ISN to entertainment. These are 10 real accounts from the Alaskan wilderness, a place so vast and so empty that people can vanish without a trace, where rescue teams find things they can never explain, and where the official reports always say, natural causes, even when nothing about the death is natural. Here is what terrifies me most. 3 of the people in these stories are still missing. Their families are still searching, and something in the Alaskan bush is still waiting. But here is my promise to you, and this is why you need to watch until the very end. At the conclusion of this video, I'll reveal the one pattern that connects all 10 stories. The common thread that could save your life if you ever find yourself in remote Alaska. This information ISN in any official survival guide. It's something I discovered by analyzing these cases, and it's the reason the Alaskan state troopers asked me to stop investigating. Now, before we descend into the frozen darkness, you need to do 4 critical things right now. First, subscribe to Midnight Whispers stories immediately. Why? Because next week, I'm releasing the cases that were too disturbing to include in this compilation. Stories involving entire rescue teams that went missing. Stories about camps where everyone disappeared in a single night. Stories that made seasoned bush pilots refuse to fly certain routes ever again. Subscribers get early access 48 hours before anyone else. Second, SMS hit that bell icon and turn on all notifications. I upload every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what is coming. We rebuilding the largest community of true horror enthusiasts who aren't too afraid to look into the darkness. And the Alaskan wilderness is the deepest darkness there is. Third, drop a comment right this second. Tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it in your location? And this is crucial. Have you ever been to Alaska or experienced something unexplainable in remote wilderness? I am tracking something disturbing. Viewers who watch these Alaska stories late at night report hearing sounds they can identify. Scratching, breathing, footsteps outside their windows. Your comment might be the key to understanding what is happening. Fourth, and this might save your life, there is a specific detail hidden in story number 7 that every survival expert in Alaska knows but will never tell outsiders. If you catch it, if you understand its significance, comment the timestamp. Only 2% of viewers ever notice it. Let's see if you were one of them. One final warning before we begin. If they ever been to Alaska, if they ever worked on the North Slope or in the bush villages, if they ever flown over that endless wilderness, you might recognize some of these locations. You might remember hearing about these incidents, and you might finally understand why the old-timers told you to never ask questions about certain places. Now, let me tell you about the 23 unmarked graves that a surveyor found in the middle of nowhere, and why the federal government made him disappear. Story 1, Bush Camp with Too Many Graves. I found 23 graves at an abandoned bush camp, and there were no missing person reports that matched them. No families searching for lost loved ones. No official records of anyone ever being at that location. This is my horrifying account of discovering what appeared to be a cemetery hidden in the Alaskan wilderness, and learning that some deaths are deliberately kept secret. My name is Gregory Hayes, and I was a geological surveyor working for a mining company evaluating potential extraction sites in remote Alaska. My job was to map terrain, take soil samples, and assess the viability of mining operations across thousands of square miles of undeveloped wilderness. I had done this work for 15 years across multiple continents. I thought I understood the risks and realities of working in isolated places. I was completely unprepared for what I would discover in a remote valley 90 miles from the nearest town. I was conducting a survey of an area that appeared on older maps as a potential mining zone. The terrain was rugged and difficult, requiring multiple days of hiking and camping to properly assess. I had set up a temporary camp near a creek, preparing to conduct detailed geological testing the following day. As I was arranging my equipment, I noticed something eerie about the landscape around my camp. The vegetation pattern was unusual. There were areas where trees and shrubs seemed to grow in a specific configuration, almost like they were arranged deliberately. The more I examined the terrain, the more I became convinced that someone had deliberately altered this landscape. I decided to investigate further before beginning my official survey work. Following the unusual vegetation patterns, I discovered what appeared to be an old campsite. There was evidence of structures that had been removed or dismantled. There were fire pits and cleared areas where buildings had obviously stood. The site was old, maybe decades old, and had been carefully cleared of any structures that might identify its purpose. But what made the hair on my neck stand on end was what I found distributed across the campsite. Graves. Unmarked mounds of earth arranged in precise, orderly rows. I counted carefully as I walked the perimeter of what appeared to be a cemetery. 23 graves. 23 distinct mounds, each marked only by a wooden post that had weathered away to almost nothing. I immediately understood that I had discovered something that someone wanted to keep hidden. This was not a natural burial ground. This was a deliberate, organized cemetery hidden in the Alaskan wilderness. The graves were too numerous and too organized to be accidental. Someone had lived at this camp, and multiple people had died here. I took photographs and detailed measurements of the gravesite. I documented the apparent age of the graves based on the deterioration of the wooden markers and the vegetation growth over the mounds. Based on the condition of the site, I estimated the graves ranged in age from perhaps 10 years old to possibly 40 or 50 years old. This cemetery had been accumulating bodies for decades. That night, I sat in my tent unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about those 23 graves. Who had lived at that camp? What was its purpose? Why were there so many graves? And most disturbingly, why had no one reported these deaths? Why was there no missing persons record that matched 23 disappearances? The next morning, I made the decision to conduct a careful investigation of the gravesite itself. Using a small shovel, I carefully excavated one of the oldest-looking graves, the one at the far end of the cemetery that had the most deteriorated marker. I dug carefully and respectfully, understanding that I was disturbing human remains, but believing it was necessary to understand what had happened here. About 2 feet down, I found bones, human bones, arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate burial position. The bones were old and bleached, suggesting this grave was indeed several decades old. I found fragments of fabric, remnants of what might have been clothing. Nothing that could be easily identified or traced. I replaced the earth carefully and moved to another grave, one that appeared slightly more recent. This excavation revealed similar results. Human remains, deliberately buried, completely unmarked. Nothing that would allow identification. Nothing that would link the grave to any particular person or time period. By the time I had excavated 3 graves, I understood the pattern. This was a burial ground where someone had been disposing of bodies without any intention of them ever being identified or discovered. This was a place where deaths were being hidden, where people were disappearing without any official record of their disappearance. I decided I needed to document everything and report it to authorities immediately. I photographed every grave. I noted coordinates and detailed measurements. I collected samples of the wooden markers for potential dating analysis. And then I prepared to hike out of the valley and contact law enforcement. That is when I noticed the tracks. They were recent. Within the past day or two at most. Multiple boot prints arranged in a pattern that suggested someone had been observing the gravesite. The prints circled the cemetery multiple times, as if someone had been walking the perimeter repeatedly. The prints also led deeper into the forest, following a path that suggested someone had been traveling regularly between the cemetery and somewhere else in the surrounding wilderness. I followed the tracks, driven by an eerie compulsion to understand more about the cemetery and who had been maintaining it. The trail led through dense forest toward a distant ridge. As I followed the tracks, I began to notice other evidence of human presence. Cut branches, marked trees, a deliberately maintained trail. After nearly an hour of hiking, I encountered the structure. It was partially hidden by dense vegetation and natural rock formations. It appeared to be a hunting cabin, built from logs in the style of bush structures constructed decades ago. But unlike a normal hunting cabin, this one was surrounded by barriers. Fencing made from sharpened logs. Barriers designed to keep something in or keep something out. The cabin had only one entrance, a heavily reinforced door secured with multiple locks and chains. The eerie feeling I had experienced at the cemetery intensified dramatically. This cabin was not a normal shelter. This was something purpose-built for a specific reason, and based on the proximity to the cemetery, I could only assume it was related to the graves. I did not attempt to enter the cabin. Instead, I returned to the cemetery and began gathering my equipment to leave the area. Something was profoundly wrong with this place. Something was eerie and disturbing and utterly wrong. I needed to leave and contact authorities. As I was packing my tent and supplies, I noticed movement in the forest surrounding the cemetery. Not the movement of animals, the purposeful movement of a person or persons. I was being watched. I was being observed by someone, possibly multiple people, who did not want me discovering what I had found. I rapidly completed my packing and began hiking toward the creek that would lead me out of the valley. Behind me, I could hear people following, not approaching aggressively, just keeping pace, maintaining visual contact, making certain I was leaving. The hike out of that valley took 6 hours. The entire time, I was aware of people in the forest around me. They never revealed themselves completely. They never attempted to stop me or confront me directly. They simply followed, ensuring I was leaving, ensuring I would not return. When I reached the settlement where I had based my mining survey operation, I immediately contacted law enforcement and reported what I had discovered. State troopers took my detailed information and photographs. They seemed to take the report seriously initially. They assured me they would investigate the cemetery site. But then something changed. 2 days after filing my report, I was contacted by a federal official. He informed me that the gravesite was part of an old mining operation from the 1960s, and that the graves contained workers who had died in mining accidents. The site was considered a historical location that had already been documented and cataloged by federal authorities. No further investigation was necessary. The explanation was a lie. I knew it was a lie. The number of graves, the circumstances of the burial, the hidden cabin, the people following me out of the valley, all of it indicated something far more sinister than a simple mining accident cemetery. But when I attempted to press the authorities for a more thorough investigation, I was told to stop asking questions. I was informed that my mining contract with the company had been terminated. I was advised to leave Alaska and not return. The message was clear and absolutely terrifying. Whatever was at that campsite, whatever explanation those graves represented, it was being deliberately protected by people in positions of authority. I left Alaska the following week. Since then, I have conducted extensive research into mining operations in remote Alaska from the 1960s forward. I have found records of multiple mining camps and operations in that region. But the particular location where I discovered the cemetery does not appear in any official records. There is no documented mining claim. There is no record of workers or deaths. It is as if the camp never officially existed. I have also researched missing persons reports for that general region over the past 50 years. There have been dozens of people reported missing in the surrounding area. But their disappearances have been attributed to hiking accidents, plane crashes, hypothermia, and other standard wilderness causes. None have ever been officially linked to the cemetery I discovered. I have concluded that the gravesite represents something far more eerie than mining accident casualties. I believe that the cabin in the forest was housing something that required those graves, something that required a carefully maintained secret, something that required federal authorities to actively cover up evidence of its existence. I do not know what killed 23 people in that valley. I do not know what was being housed in that reinforced cabin. I do not know why federal authorities moved so quickly to suppress investigation and silence my reporting. But I know that whatever it was, it is still there. Still active. Still claiming victims whose disappearances are being deliberately obscured. Several months ago, I was contacted by a researcher investigating missing persons cases in Alaska. She had found a pattern similar to what I had discovered. Multiple disappearances in remote areas. No official linking between the cases. Federal intervention preventing thorough investigation. She was asking questions about the cemetery I had found. Before I could respond to her inquiry, she stopped contacting me. I do not know what happened to her. I only know that she asked the wrong questions about the wrong people, and then she simply disappeared. Another person lost in the vast, eerie Alaskan wilderness. Another missing person case that would likely be attributed to accident or misadventure rather than the terrifying truth. If you ever discover evidence of something eerie in remote Alaska, if you ever find graves that do not appear on official records, if you ever encounter federal interference in what should be a straightforward investigation, understand what is happening. Understand that there are places in Alaska where activities are being deliberately concealed. Understand that there are authorities willing to suppress investigation and silence witnesses to protect whatever is happening in the Alaskan bush. And understand that the cemetery I found is not unique. There are other camps, other graves, other hidden locations scattered across Alaska, this vast wilderness, each one containing the remains of people whose disappearances have been deliberately obscured, each one protected by a conspiracy of silence involving authorities at multiple levels of government. The Alaskan wilderness is vast and empty and full of terrifying secrets. And somewhere in that darkness, there are still 23 graves, still a cabin hidden in the forest. Still people or authorities actively working to keep those graves undiscovered. Still something eerie and wrong that required all those deaths to remain hidden. Story 2. Radio that knew our names. The radio started speaking names on the 7th night, and I knew immediately that nothing would ever be normal again. My name is Edward Carlson. I spent the winter of 2018 managing a research station in the Notak National Preserve, about 160 miles from any human settlement. The station monitored wildlife populations and environmental data. The work was solitary by design. I was there alone from October through March, collecting observations, maintaining equipment, recording everything that happened in that remote corner of Alaska. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd chosen it specifically. The kind of person who wants to disappear into the wilderness for half a year understands something about themselves that civilian life can accommodate. I needed the silence. I needed the distance from other people. I needed to exist in a place where human concerns meant nothing and nature was the only reality that mattered. The station was a prefabricated structure flown in by helicopter. 2 rooms, a generator, a kitchenette, a radio for emergencies. The radio was shortwave, connected to a repeater system that supposedly reached Fairbanks and Anchorage. I detested it when I arrived. It worked fine. I received weather updates. I confirmed my position. I made contact with the main office. Everything functioned normally. The eerie thing about isolated bush stations is the silence between transmissions. Hours and hours of static. The white noise of electromagnetic frequencies searching for signals that rarely come. You learn to live with the sound. You learn to tune it out, the way you might tune out the hum of an appliance in your home. The first sign something was wrong came on day 7 of my isolation. I was sitting near the radio, recording observations in my journal. The static was constant, as always. The generator outside hummed steadily. The Arctic night was pressing against the windows, absolute and complete. The kind of darkness that exists nowhere else on Earth during certain times of year. The static changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The quality of the white noise shifted. It became less random, more structured. I noticed patterns emerging from what should have been meaningless noise. And then, beneath the static, a voice began to form. It was speaking a name. The voice was distorted, mechanical, barely recognizable as human. But the name it spoke was unmistakable. Edward. My name, Edward, 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 repeating over and over. I stood up immediately. My hands were shaking. I checked the radio dial. I hadn't moved it. The frequency was locked where it was supposed to be. I tried tuning to other channels. The name continued on every frequency. Edward, 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 speaking in that horrible, distorted voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away. The truly terrifying realization came quickly. No one knew I was there except the people at the main office in Fairbanks. They never broadcast my name on the emergency channel. There was no reason for anyone to be transmitting my personal name through the radio system. I shut off the radio. The silence that followed was profound. The absence of static and the distorted voice created a void in the constant background noise. I stood in that silence, trying to rationalize what I heard. Equipment malfunction. A strange atmospheric phenomenon. Someone testing the system. Something explainable. But the eerie certainty was growing in my mind that something was very wrong. I waited an hour before turning the radio back on. When I did, the static resumed normally. No voice. No names. Just the familiar white noise. I tried calling the main office. Nothing but static. I tried the emergency frequency. More static. The radio seemed to be working, but no one was responding. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness of the station, listening to the static and the wind outside and the sound of my own breathing. The chilling question kept repeating in my mind. How did my name end up on that radio? Who was transmitting it? What did it mean? By the second day, the terrifying incidents had escalated. The radio began transmitting other names. Names I recognized. My ex-wife, my mother, my brother, names of people I'd known in my past. All of them coming through that horrible, distorted voice in the static. Each name repeated obsessively, over and over, until I shut off the radio in desperation. The disturbing part was the frequency of the transmissions. As soon as I turned the radio back on, the names would resume. Different names. Always names I recognized. Always spoken in that mechanical, chilling voice that sounded like it was being produced by something that wasn't quite human. I tried documenting it. I wrote down the names. I noted the times. I recorded audio on my satellite phone. The recordings captured the voice, the names, and the terrible context of absolute isolation with something that seemed to know my personal history broadcasting through the radio system. On day 4, a new pattern emerged. The radio began transmitting names of people who weren't from my past. Names I'd never heard before, but the voice spoke them with the same obsessive, chilling repetition. And then something worse happened. The voice began speaking names simultaneously. Multiple voices speaking multiple names at the same time. The effect was cacophonous and disturbing, like dozens of entities trying to communicate through a single radio transmission. The eerie quality of those overlapping voices suggested intelligence, purpose. The radio wasn't malfunctioning randomly. Something was deliberately using it to communicate. Something that could access the entire radio frequency system. Something that had access to information about who I was. By day 5, I made the decision to attempt contact with the main office through my satellite phone. The phone had limited battery and a monthly data allotment. I'd been conserving it for emergencies. This qualified as an emergency. The conversation with my supervisor was brief and useless. He said he had no explanation. The radio systems were working normally on their end. No other personnel had reported anomalies. He suggested the isolation was affecting my judgment. He recommended I document everything and prepare a complete report for when I returned. The chilling implication was that they didn't believe me. Or worse, that they believed something far worse than equipment malfunction, and they didn't want to acknowledge it. That night, the radio transmission changed completely. Instead of just names, the voice began speaking sentences. Fragmented thoughts. Impossible communications. The voice spoke about things that were happening inside the station. Things only I would know. Private moments. Memories. Thoughts I never shared with anyone. The radio described a nightmare I had on the second night of my isolation. It described the exact content. A terrifying dream about drowning in an ocean of blood. The radio knew about my fear of water. The radio knew about my childhood trauma. The radio knew things that existed only in my mind. The truly unsettling realization hit like ice water. Whatever was transmitting through that radio was reading my thoughts, accessing my memories, communicating directly from inside my consciousness. I turned off the radio and sealed it in a cabinet. I decided I would ignore it. I would continue my work. I would wait for the weather to clear and hope a supply plane might come early and extract me from this nightmare. The chilling certainty was that leaving the station was my only option. But the radio continued transmitting even when turned off. I could hear it from inside the cabinet. The voice, the names, the disturbing, impossible communications growing louder and more insistent. The cabinet door vibrated from the internal transmission. The metal case showed no signs of damage, but the voice continued pouring out of it like something was forcing its way through the physical structure of the equipment. On day 6, I opened the cabinet to try to disassemble the radio. I thought maybe if I removed the power source, the transmissions would stop. But when I opened the cabinet, the radio was hot, dangerously hot. Steam rose from it. The voice coming from the speaker was screaming now. Not words, not names, just pure, anguished screaming that sounded like dozens of people in unbearable pain. I slammed the cabinet shut and backed away. The screaming continued for 3 hours. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. When I opened the cabinet again, the radio was cold. Completely cold. The dial had moved. The frequency had changed. I hadn't touched it. Something had moved that dial deliberately while I wasn't looking. The eerie frequency now displayed was one I'd never seen before. The number was impossible, higher than any normal radio could broadcast. I turned the radio on, and the voice returned. But this time, it was different. The voice sounded almost human now, almost familiar. It sounded like it could be my voice, distorted slightly, speaking in cadences that mimicked my speech patterns. The voice said my name. Then it said, "You can, to leave. You were already part of the broadcast now. Your name is being transmitted to every station, every frequency, every place that has a radio. Everyone is hearing your name right now. Everyone knows where you are. Everyone is coming for you." The chilling terror of that statement consumed me completely. The realization that my isolation was no longer isolation. That whatever had claimed the radio had also claimed my position. That I'd been broadcasting my location and my identity and my consciousness across the entire radio spectrum. I took the radio outside and smashed it against the rocks. I hit it repeatedly until the components scattered across the frozen ground. I buried the pieces. I destroyed the power cable. I obliterated every component I could find. When I returned to the station, a new radio had appeared on the table. It was the same model as the one I destroyed. Pristine, undamaged, The dial was already tuned to that impossible frequency. When I turned it on, the voice, my voice, greeted me by name. By day 7 of my isolation, I stopped fighting. I sat in the station and listened to the radio transmit my name and my memories and my thoughts across frequencies I didn't, to understand, to destinations I couldn't, to identify. The voice that sounded like me explained that the broadcast would continue forever. That my name was now part of the electromagnetic fabric of the Arctic. That I would never truly leave this place because this place had learned to speak with my voice. The supply plane came on day 32. The pilot found me alive but uncommunicative. I was unable to explain what had happened during that isolation. I couldn't to articulate the terrifying certainty that I was still transmitting. That my consciousness was still being broadcast even though I was no longer in the station. The eerie thing is that I still hear it sometimes. In the static of any radio. In the white noise between stations. A voice speaking my name. Speaking about this moment. Speaking about the future. Speaking as if I am still there in that frozen station. Broadcasting to an audience that exists in frequencies beyond normal perception. The most disturbing realization is this: I was never actually rescued. The plane, the return to civilization, the normal life I appear to be living now, it's all part of the broadcast. The radio never stopped transmitting. It's still broadcasting my story right now. Every word I speak is being carried on frequencies that penetrate everything. When you listen to this story, you retuning into that broadcast. You rehearing my voice travel through the radio system that connects us all. And somewhere in the Arctic, in a frozen station surrounded by darkness, the radio is still speaking. It's still speaking names. And if you listen carefully, really carefully, you might hear yours. Story 3. Bush child who wouldn't to go outside. A 7-year-old girl was rescued from an isolated homestead deep in the Alaskan bush, and she would not explain why she refused to step outside anymore. She would not speak about what lived near the trees. She would only sit in darkened rooms and stare at the windows, her small body trembling whenever anyone approached the doors or tried to convince her to go outdoors. This is my horrifying account of discovering why that child was so terrified, and what might still be waiting at the tree line. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I was called in as a social worker to assess a child welfare situation in remote Alaska. The girl, whose name was Emma, had been living alone with her mother at an isolated homestead 70 miles from the nearest town. The mother had suffered a severe stroke and was hospitalized, leaving Emma alone in the cabin for 3 days before a search and rescue team found her. When rescue arrived, they discovered something eerie. Emma was barricaded inside the cabin. All the windows were covered with blankets. The doors were secured with multiple locks from the inside. Emma had enough food and water to survive, but she was clearly terrified. Most terrifying was her absolute refusal to leave the cabin. The rescue team had to physically carry her outside, and when they did, she screamed with such primal terror that they immediately brought her back inside. Emma was placed temporarily in my care at the regional hospital while her mother recovered and Child Protective Services determined the best course of action. My job was to assess her mental state and determine if she had experienced any trauma beyond her mother's medical emergency. From our first session, Emma was clearly traumatized by something. She would not make eye contact. She would not discuss her time alone in the cabin. She would sit perfectly still for hours, her eyes fixed on the window, her small hands clenched into fists. When I tried to encourage her to talk about her mother or her life in the bush, she would shake her head and say nothing. What troubled me most was her response whenever I suggested she might eventually return to outdoor activities. She would begin to shake. Tears would stream down her face. She would whisper a single phrase, over and over, "It will see me. It will know I am there." I tried to understand what it was. I asked her to describe what she was afraid of. She would only repeat that she could not talk about it. That talking about it made it more real. That if she described it, if she gave it words and form, it would know she had noticed it more fully, and it would find her even inside the hospital. I consulted with a child psychologist who suggested severe trauma-induced selective mutism. Emma had experienced something so frightening in that isolated homestead that her mind had shut down and refused to process or discuss the experience. The psychologist recommended continued hospitalization and therapy, but also warned that it might take months or years before Emma was willing or able to discuss what had happened. I decided I needed to understand the situation more completely. I traveled to the homestead with a local guide to examine the property and see if I could determine what might have frightened Emma so severely. The cabin was typical of remote Alaskan homesteads. Small, insulated for brutal winters, surrounded by dense forest. The interior was organized and clean, suggesting Emma's mother was a responsible caretaker despite the isolation. But what struck me immediately was the condition of the windows and doors. Heavy wooden boards had been nailed over the interior of every window. The boards were old, suggesting they had been in place for years, not just since Emma's mother's stroke. The doors had multiple locks, and on every exterior door frame, there were scratches. Deep scratches, as if something had been clawing at the wood for an extended period. The guide, a man named Paul, seemed unsettled by the property. He suggested we not linger. He said the homestead had an eerie feeling to it, that the previous owners before Emma's family had moved out suddenly, leaving most of their possessions behind. That locals knew something was wrong with that property, though no one would explicitly say what. I pressed him for information. Paul finally told me something that made the situation far more terrifying. He said that children who lived at that homestead never adjusted well to the isolation. They became withdrawn and paranoid. Some had refused to leave the cabin, just like Emma. Others had tried to escape into the forest and had to be retrieved by search and rescue teams. The pattern had repeated with multiple families over the decades. One family with a young boy had left so suddenly that the mother later required psychiatric hospitalization. She would not explain what her son had seen, but she had nightmares about trees, about things moving between the trees, about something that watched the cabin at night. I examined the property more closely. The forest around the cabin was dense and old. The trees were massive, blocking most light from reaching the ground. The space between the trees was shadowed and eerie. The ground was covered with moss and fallen needles, creating a soft, undisturbed appearance. But looking more carefully, I could see trails. Animal trails, certainly, but also something else. Paths that seemed too deliberate, too frequent, too purposeful to be made by regular wildlife. I found something else near the tree line, about 50 yards from the cabin. A series of objects arranged in a specific pattern on the forest floor. Bones, animal bones, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental scatter. The bones formed a kind of barrier or line that extended along the edge of the cleared property, as if something had been marking territory. Paul urged me to leave immediately. He said we should not be outside when darkness fell, that the eerie things about the property became more apparent after sunset, that whatever lived in those trees became more active during the dark hours. We returned to the cabin as the light began to fade. I could not help but notice that the forest became more hostile as darkness approached. The shadows deepened. The space between the trees seemed to move. The silence became heavier, more deliberate, and I could feel it. A presence, something watching from the darkness beyond the cleared property, something aware of our presence inside the cabin. That night, I experienced something that helped me understand why Emma was so terrified. As darkness became complete, something began to circle the cabin. I could hear it moving through the forest, not the sound of a normal animal, not the breaking of twigs or the crashing of brush. This was something deliberate moving through the darkness without making noise until it chose to. The footsteps were heavy, the breathing was wet and labored, and occasionally I would hear something that sounded almost like communication. Clicks or chirps or something between the two. The thing circled the cabin all night. Sometimes it would approach one window, and I would see a shadow cross the boarded-up glass. Sometimes it would move to a door, and I would hear scratching or sniffing. It never seemed violent or aggressive. It seemed curious, aware, intelligent. It seemed to be studying the cabin, learning its layout, understanding the barriers that kept it out. Around 3 a.m, it stopped moving. The circling ceased. The sounds vanished. There was only silence. But that silence was worse than the sounds. It suggested the thing had finished its inspection and was now simply waiting, watching, anticipating. When dawn came, we left immediately. I never returned to that homestead. I filed my report stating that Emma had experienced severe trauma related to extended isolation, and that she required continued psychiatric care. I made no mention of what I had heard in the night. I made no discussion of the bone markers or the scratches on the doors. I made no attempt to explain the eerie presence that had circled the cabin while we sheltered inside. Because some knowledge is dangerous, some understanding should not be shared or documented. Some mysteries are safer left unsolved. Emma remained hospitalized for 6 months. During that time, she gradually became more comfortable speaking about everyday things. Her mother recovered and expressed desire to rebuild their life elsewhere, anywhere but that isolated homestead. The property was eventually abandoned. No family would accept assignment there, despite the government offering substantial incentives. 3 years later, I received a letter from Emma. She was 10 years old and living with her mother in a town near Fairbanks. She wrote that she was doing well, that she was in school, that she had made friends. But she wrote something that still haunts me. I can feel it sometimes. Even in town, in quiet moments, I feel it watching me still. It has not forgotten about me. It knows where I live now. It knows I'm alive. And I think it is coming closer. I do not know how long it will take, but I think eventually it will find me again. I think that is why it let me go that day. It was not done with me. It was only releasing me so it could hunt me across greater distances. I attempted to contact Emma's mother, but she would not respond to my inquiries. I tried to track her location, but her information became unavailable. It was as if they had disappeared deliberately, moving off any grid that would allow someone to find them. I have since researched the history of that homestead and the surrounding property. I found records of 6 families living there over the past 40 years. 5 of those families left suddenly and reported severe psychological distress. One family lost a child to what was officially recorded as an accidental drowning, though the nearest body of water was 12 miles away. The eerie thing that lives in the trees near that homestead has learned to wait. It has learned to study humans. It has learned how to mark its territory and defend its space. It has learned that children are particularly susceptible to its eerie presence. And it has learned that if it releases its prey occasionally, if it allows someone to escape and live in the wider world, it can hunt them across greater distances, keeping them in a state of paranoia and fear. Emma's refusal to go outside was not a sign of psychological trauma alone. It was recognition. It was a child. This primal understanding that stepping beyond the cabin, this protection would make her visible to something that had already noticed her, that had already decided she was worth hunting. If you ever travel to remote Alaskan homesteads, if you ever find yourself in an isolated cabin surrounded by dense forest, pay attention to the children. If they refuse to play outside, if they barricade themselves in the cabin, if they stare at the windows with expressions of pure terror, understand that they are not being paranoid or dramatic. They are responding to something real, something eerie and terrifying that lives in the darkness between the trees. And if you ever find yourself alone in that forest at night, if you hear the slow, deliberate footsteps and the labored breathing, do not try to see what is approaching. Do not try to understand or confront it. Simply return to the cabin, lock the doors, board the windows, and wait for dawn. Because the thing that lives in those trees is patient. It is intelligent. It understands human fear better than any human being can. And once it has noticed you, once it has circled your shelter and learned your patterns, it will never truly let you go. Emma was released because the thing that hunted her decided she was more interesting alive and running. And somewhere out there in Alaska, that child is still being hunted. Still looking over her shoulder, still wondering when it will finally decide to stop releasing her and keep her forever. Story 4. Abandoned Grounds. The entire village stopped going into the forest 3 years ago, and nobody will explain why. When I asked directly, the silence was scarier than any answer could have been. My name is Catherine Winters, and I moved to the small Alaskan village of Kaltag to be a teacher. Population around 300 people. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone. A real community in the remote Alaska bush. Surviving through hunting, fishing, and subsistence, living in one of Earth's harshest environments. I was excited about the position. I wanted to teach in a place that mattered, where education could genuinely change lives. Kaltag seemed perfect. The job was stable. Housing was provided. The community seemed welcoming, at least initially. But something was wrong with the village, and I started noticing it within the first week. The hunting patterns were strange. The men still went out regularly, but not to the traditional hunting grounds. They traveled south and west, toward terrain that was less productive, more difficult to navigate. I asked one of the hunters, a man named Dennis, why they weren't using the old territories to the north. The territories that were supposed to be excellent for moose and caribou. He just looked at me for a long time without answering. Then he said they didn't hunt there anymore, and I should ask my students about it instead. I did ask my students. The question made them uncomfortable. They exchanged looks like they were silently deciding whether to answer. Finally, one of the older kids, a boy named Thomas, said that the forest to the north wasn't safe anymore. When I pressed for details, he wouldn't say more. The other kids just watched me with expressions that seemed to contain a mixture of pity and warning. I decided to investigate myself. I am an experienced hiker. I've spent time in wilderness environments. The idea of abandoned hunting grounds intrigued me, and I wanted to understand what made them so dangerous that an entire community would simply stop using them. I prepared carefully. Good boots, warm layers, navigation equipment, a satellite communicator. I didn't tell anyone in the village where I was going. I thought that if the hunting grounds were genuinely dangerous, the villagers might try to stop me from exploring. And I was stubborn enough not to appreciate being prevented from making my own decisions. I hiked into the northern forest on a clear afternoon in late September. The initial landscape was beautiful. Dense spruce forest, rolling terrain. The kind of scenery that makes you understand why people have survived in this region for thousands of years. The wildlife was abundant. I saw caribou tracks, evidence of moose movement. The forest was healthy and thriving. But there was something else. The forest felt watched. I can describe it more accurately than that. There was a sense of attention being directed at me. Not threatening exactly, but definitely present. I told myself it was paranoia. Just being alone in the wilderness making my mind play tricks. But the feeling persisted. After about 3 miles, I started seeing things that didn't make sense. There were structures in the forest. Small constructions, cairns made of stone, patterns created from fallen branches arranged in geometric designs. At first, I thought they might be trail markers. But they were too numerous, too deliberately placed, too organized. This wasn't natural or accidental. Someone or something was creating these structures methodically throughout the forest. I documented them with photographs. I noted their locations. I continued deeper into the woods, becoming increasingly fascinated and increasingly unnerved. The cairns grew more elaborate. Some were clearly old, weathered by years of exposure. Others looked newer, and they seemed to follow a pattern, creating a kind of invisible path deeper into the forest. I realized I was following the structures without consciously deciding to do so. My feet were just moving in the direction the markers pointed. After about 6 miles, I found something that made me stop completely. A clearing, roughly circular, completely natural except for one detail. The entire clearing was surrounded by a ring of cairns. Dozens of them, all approximately the same size. All arranged in a perfect circle around the empty space, and in the center of that circle, there was a pole. A wooden pole, maybe 8 feet tall, planted directly in the ground. But the pole was decorated with objects, items tied to it with sinew or twine. I moved closer to examine the objects. Most of them were animal remains. Bones, skulls, teeth, but mixed among the animal parts were human items. Clothing, jewelry, what looked like personal effects. And some of the bones were human bones. I felt my heart rate spike. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was evidence of something intentional, something disturbing, something that the village must have known about. I documented everything with my camera. I was shaking, but I forced myself to remain methodical. I collected information. I took measurements. I noted the details. That is when I heard the sound. It came from deeper in the forest. A low vocalization that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. It was sustained, monotone, almost musical in a deeply wrong way. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. Everything in my body was suddenly screaming that I needed to leave immediately. I left the clearing and retraced my route back toward the village. The sun was starting to set, and the forest was becoming increasingly dark. I moved as quickly as I safely could, following the path I created on the way in. But I knew I was being followed. I couldn't see anything behind me, but I could hear it. Something moving through the trees. Something large. Something that was keeping pace with my flight out of the forest. I forced myself not to run. Running triggers chase instinct. I just moved fast and steady, heading toward the village lights that I could finally see in the distance. I made it back to Kaltag as the darkness became complete. The entire village seemed to be aware that I'd gone into the forest. People were standing outside, watching for my return. When I emerged from the tree line, Dennis came directly to me. His expression was extremely serious. He told me I was lucky. He said most people who went into those forests at dusk didn't come back. I tried to tell him about the clearing, about the cairns and the pole and the bones, but he cut me off. He said I needed to understand something very important. The village didn't go into the forest anymore because the forest didn't want them to. And the forest had ways of expressing that preference. I asked him what he meant. He said I'd understand better once I lived through a winter in Kaltag. Over the next few months, I started learning the truth through careful observation and indirect questioning. The hunting grounds to the north had been abandoned about 5 years ago after a series of disappearances. Hunters would go out, and some of them would never return. At first, the village assumed accidents, bad weather, wildlife encounters, things that happened sometimes in the bush. But then, other hunters started reporting sightings. They described seeing the missing people in the forest. But the missing people weren't moving like humans should move. They were moving in synchronized patterns, moving through the forest in groups, all moving in the same direction, never deviating, like they were part of something larger. Then the missing people started coming back to the village. But they weren't the same. They would appear at the edge of the forest, just standing there, staring at the village. Their families would rush out to greet them, but the returned people wouldn't respond to voices. They would just stand there, completely motionless, staring. After a few hours, they would turn and walk back into the forest, and they would never be seen again. Eventually, the village decided that the forest was no longer safe. They abandoned the traditional hunting grounds and shifted their operations to less productive but safer territory. For 5 years, nobody had gone into the northern forest, and nobody had gone missing. But I had gone into the forest, and something there had noticed me. I started experiencing dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams where I was walking through the forest at night. In the dreams, I could see the cairns in the central clearing with perfect clarity. And I could see the structures were growing. The cairns were multiplying. The pole was becoming more elaborate. More bones were being added. And in my dreams, I was contributing to it. I would wake up in my bed with dirt under my fingernails, with scratches on my arms, with no memory of leaving my house, but absolute certainty that I had been in that forest. The village noticed. Dennis came to me and asked if I had been returning to the forest at night. I told him the truth. I said I had been having dreams. He told me it was too late for that. He said once the forest had your attention, it didn't just use you when you slept. It was only a matter of time before I walked into the woods deliberately. Before I chose to go back, I tried to leave Caltag. I requested a transfer. I said I couldn't work as a teacher anymore. I needed to go back to civilization. But the bush plane that was supposed to pick me up never arrived. The pilot reported mechanical problems. By the time another pilot was available, the weather had turned bad. Winter was closing in. I am still in Caltag. I've been here for 3 years now. The dreams have changed. They were no longer dreams. They were memories of things I've actually done. I remember walking into the forest on multiple occasions. I remember the cairns becoming more numerous. I remember the pole growing taller. I remember adding things to it. I remember standing in the clearing at night with others. Not people from the village. Other things. Other beings that moved like humans but weren't human. Standing in perfect circles around that central pole. Standing completely still. Standing and waiting for something that hasn't come yet. Last month, a new teacher arrived to replace me. Her name is Amanda. She is young. She is idealistic. She is exactly what I was when I first came to this village. I've been trying to warn her. I've been trying to explain what happened to me. What is happening to me? What will eventually happen to her? But she doesn't believe me. She thinks I'm crazy. And I can't tell her what I need to tell her. Which is the most terrifying part. Because if I spoke the truth directly, if I told her explicitly about the forest and the cairns and what is waiting there, I would be helping it recruit her faster. Silence is the only protection I can offer. But silence won't help her for long. I can already see her making plans to explore the forest. I can see the curiosity in her eyes when she looks toward the northern tree line. The forest is already calling her. And I understand now that this is how it works. This is how it grows. It needs people who are curious. People who want to listen to warnings. People who believe they are strong enough to resist. The entire village is part of its expansion. We've all been collected in one way or another. They all become part of the structure it's building in that clearing. And the pole keeps growing taller. I don't know how many people it will need before whatever it is summoning finally arrives. But I know it's patient. It knows we have nowhere to go. We can't escape the bush during winter. We can't flee across the frozen landscape. We trapped here, slowly being added to its growing architecture. Sometimes I walk to the edge of the village at night and I can see the clearing in my mind. I can see the cairns arranged in their geometric patterns. I can see the pole towering above the trees. And I can see all of us standing in that clearing, perfectly still, waiting for something we don't. Do you understand? And I know that Amanda is going to go into that forest soon. I know because I went too. And they seen it. Once it seen you, leaving ISN to an option anymore. The village that doesn't to use the forest anymore ISN to safe because it is avoiding danger. It is safe because the forest already has everything it needs from here. And we were all waiting for it to be complete. Story 5. Missing float plane on the Yukon. The float plane vanished in perfect weather, and nothing was ever found. Not a piece of wreckage, not a fuel slick on the water, not a trace of the 3 people inside. This is my terrifying account of investigating that disappearance and discovering that some places on the Yukon River were never meant to be crossed. My name is Captain Michael Vaughn, and I was hired as a private investigator to look into the disappearance of a float plane that went missing on the Yukon River near the Canadian border. The pilot was an experienced man named Robert Chen. The passengers were 2 geologists studying the region for mineral deposits. The plane left the village of Eagle, Alaska on a clear afternoon in September with perfect visibility and calm water conditions. The flight plan showed a route up the Yukon toward a remote research site 90 miles north. The flight was supposed to take just over 2 hours. The plane never arrived at the destination. The remote camp radioed back that Chen had not checked in as expected. Search and rescue was mobilized immediately. The search was extensive and immediate. Helicopters covered the river route. Boats searched both banks. Divers checked the river bottom and likely crash locations. The weather remained clear and favorable for search operations. But nothing was found. No debris, no oil slick, no wreckage. It was as if the float plane had simply ceased to exist. The official investigation concluded that the plane must have crashed in the river and sunk without leaving debris. Perhaps an undetectable mechanical failure. Perhaps a collision with an unseen object. The river was vast and deep in many places. A sunk aircraft could remain hidden for years. But when I reviewed the case files, certain details troubled me. The plane's last radio transmission had been received, and the pilot sounded nervous. Not panicked, not frantic, just nervous. He had reported seeing something unusual on the water ahead, something that looked like it might be debris or a hazard. He said he was going to investigate before proceeding to the landing site. That was the last anyone heard from Robert Chen or his passengers. I drove to Eagle and interviewed the radio operator who had taken Chen's final transmission. He was an older man named Paul, and he seemed reluctant to discuss the details. He kept saying that the Yukon had its own rules, its own patterns, that certain stretches of river had reputations that locals understood but outsiders did not. I pressed him for specifics. Finally, he told me about the eerie phenomenon that locals called the Yukon effect. There was a stretch of river, about 30 miles long, where pilots reported strange occurrences. Instruments would malfunction. Radio signals would become distorted. Compasses would spin erratically, and there was something in the water, something that pilots described as unusual formations or shapes that appeared on the surface. Something that seemed to follow aircraft. Something that was never quite visible enough to identify or photograph, but was terrifying enough that experienced pilots would alter their routes to avoid it. Several planes had reported the phenomenon over the years. Most pilots managed to escape the area and land safely, but a few never made it out. A bush plane in 1994, a small charter in 2003, a private aircraft in 2011. All had reported seeing something unusual in the water. All had attempted to investigate. None had ever arrived at their destinations. The official reports dismissed the phenomenon as pilot error or mechanical failure. But Paul suggested something far more eerie. He suggested that whatever was in that stretch of river was actively hunting aircraft. That it was intelligent and aware. That it was drawn to planes that slowed down or attempted to investigate it. I became convinced that Robert Chen had made a fatal mistake. He had seen something on the water, something eerie that caught his attention, and he had slowed the aircraft to get a better look. In doing so, he had offered himself to whatever dwelt in that section of the Yukon. I decided I needed to see the river for myself. I hired a local guide named Stephen who knew the river intimately. Stephen was hesitant to take me into the affected area, but I paid him enough to overcome his reservations. We took a motorboat upriver on an overcast September morning, approximately 1 week after Chen's disappearance. The river was deceptively beautiful. The banks were lined with dense forest. The water was dark and cold-looking, moving with a current that seemed purposeful. But as we approached the section where the phenomenon had been reported, the atmosphere changed. The air felt thicker. The light seemed to dim despite the sun remaining visible. The sounds of wildlife that had been present upstream began to fade away. Stephen cut the engine as we drifted into the eerie zone. He pointed toward a section of water ahead and told me to watch carefully. I saw nothing at first, just water and reflections and the movement of the current. But then I began to see them. Shapes, dark formations just beneath the surface. They moved with apparent intelligence, keeping pace with our drifting boat, as if studying us. Stephen said they had been seen many times before. Local pilots called them the sleepers because they seemed to rest beneath the water until something interesting appeared above. An aircraft, a boat, a target. The shapes circled our vessel slowly, deliberately. I could not determine what they were. They were too large to be fish, too coordinated to be natural formations. They seemed almost aware, almost curious about our presence. Stephen was visibly frightened, his hand resting on a rifle mounted in the boat. Then one of the shapes rose closer to the surface. I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach turn. It looked almost like a wing, like the wing of an enormous aircraft. But the color was wrong. The texture was wrong. It seemed to be covered with something that was not metal or normal material. Stephen started the engine and accelerated downstream immediately. He refused to speak about what I had seen or what he had witnessed. He simply repeated that we needed to leave, that we had already stayed too long, that the things in the water could become aggressive if they felt threatened. When we reached the village, Stephen would not accept his remaining payment. He told me to leave, to get away from the Yukon, to never come back to that stretch of river. He said that Robert Chen was still there, that all of them were still there, in the water, being kept by the things that lived beneath the surface. I attempted to report what I had seen to the authorities, but they were not interested. The official conclusion was already written. Mechanical failure, accident, case closed. There was no appetite for investigating something eerie and inexplicable, but I could not let it go. I began researching the history of the Yukon more deeply. I looked at records of missing planes and boats. I contacted families of other missing aircraft, and I discovered a pattern that made the situation profoundly terrifying. Over the past 40 years, 17 aircraft had gone missing in that stretch of river. 17 planes, with 53 people aboard. No bodies recovered, no wreckage found, no explanation offered. The official cause of every disappearance was listed as mechanical failure or pilot error. But the common factor was always the same. Each pilot had reported something unusual in the water just before contact was lost. I contacted a retired aviation mechanic named Henry who had inspected several of the missing planes' maintenance records. He told me something that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. The planes that had gone missing had nothing mechanically wrong with them. They were all properly maintained. They had no reason to crash. Yet they had crashed anyway. Or more accurately, they had been taken. Henry believed that whatever lived in that section of the Yukon was not interested in the aircraft itself. It was interested in what was inside. It was hunting. It was intelligent. It understood that aircraft contained living beings worth capturing. And it had learned how to lure them down to the water level by creating the appearance of hazards or unusual phenomena. I spent months researching the indigenous history of the Yukon region. I found references in old accounts to a presence in the water that was feared and respected. A thing that had lived in the Yukon for longer than human memory. Something that was not hostile unless disturbed, but that was drawn to movement and activity. Something that had learned, over centuries, how to capture the things that moved above the water. The float planes were the newest hunting ground. The aircraft represented a new kind of prey. The Yukon, this ancient horror, had adapted to the modern world. I attempted one more investigation. I hired a float plane and flew the route that Robert Chen had flown. I deliberately slowed the aircraft as I approached the eerie section of river. I wanted to trigger the phenomenon. I wanted to see what would happen. The moment I reduced altitude and speed, the instruments began to malfunction. The radio filled with static that sounded almost like voices. The compass spun wildly, and on the water below, shapes began to rise toward the surface. Massive shapes, forms that seemed to stretch across the width of the river. Forms that looked almost like hands reaching upward. Forms that made the water itself seem to convulse and move in unnatural patterns. The pilot immediately accelerated and climbed altitude, breaking away from the phenomenon. We escaped, but not before I saw something eerie. For just a moment, one of the shapes became clear enough to partially identify. It looked like aircraft wreckage. Multiple aircraft, actually, fused together, moving as a single organism. As if all the planes that had ever gone missing in that river had somehow merged into a single, grotesque entity. When we returned and I developed the photographs I had taken, one image was clear enough to confirm my worst fears. Deep in the water, illuminated briefly by the aircraft lights, I could see what appeared to be the fuselage of Chin, is float plane. But it was not sitting on the river bottom. It was being held by something, being gripped by something enormous. I closed my investigation. I filed my report and submitted it to the insurance company. I stated that the float plane had likely crashed due to mechanical failure and sunk. I provided no mention of the shapes in the water. I provided no discussion of the other missing aircraft. I provided no indication of what I had truly discovered, because some knowledge is too eerie and disturbing to share. Some mysteries are safer left unsolved. Some dangers are best left undisturbed. The Yukon has claimed 17 aircraft and 53 people that I know of. But the actual number is likely higher. The phenomenon has been occurring for longer than records exist. Indigenous people avoided that stretch of river for generations. They understood that something lived there. Something that hunted. Something that was patient and ancient and intelligent. If you ever fly a float plane in Alaska, if you ever travel the Yukon River corridor, I urge you to maintain altitude and speed. Do not investigate unusual phenomena in the water. Do not reduce your engine power out of curiosity. Do not allow yourself to become slow enough or vulnerable enough to interest the things that live beneath the surface. Because the Yukon is still hungry. The shapes are still circling below. And somewhere in the dark water, the merged remains of missing aircraft continue to move and shift, absorbed into something vast and terrifying that has learned to hunt the sky as well as the river. Robert Chen and his passengers never escaped that water. They remain there still, incorporated into the eerie mass that dwells in the Yukon. And if you slow your plane long enough, if you descend low enough, you might become part of it too. Some stretches of river are meant to be crossed quickly and without question. The Yukon teaches this lesson to every pilot foolish enough to investigate what moves beneath its dark and treacherous surface. Story 6. Abandoned winter camp with warm ashes. We found the camp in the middle of nowhere, and the fire was still burning. That should have been impossible. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. The wind howled across frozen tundra with enough force to knock a person down. Yet when we approached the abandoned shelter, we could see smoke rising from the chimney, and when I placed my hand near the fire pit outside, the ashes were warm, fresh, recent, as if someone had just left moments before we arrived. This is my horrifying account of what we discovered in that remote Alaskan wilderness, and why we should have kept searching instead of running away. My name is Richard Hayes, and I was part of a rescue team sent to locate a missing bush pilot named Stephen Oakes. Stephen had filed a flight plan for a route across the Brooks Range in northern Alaska, but he never arrived at his destination. His plane had not been located. Search and rescue efforts had covered hundreds of square miles of unforgiving terrain without finding any wreckage or sign of where he had gone. Our team consisted of 4 experienced people. Myself, another climber named Marcus, a helicopter pilot named Jennifer, and a search coordinator named Tom. We were dropped off near the last known coordinates of Stephen's flight path. The landscape was brutal, endless white, mountains in the distance that seemed to swallow light. The silence was eerie and unsettling, broken only by the wind and the sound of our snow machines. We had been searching for 3 days when we spotted the camp. It was nestled in a valley, partially hidden by rock formations. Smoke rose from the chimney. There was a snow machine parked outside, covered in a light dusting of fresh snow. It looked abandoned, yet simultaneously occupied. The contradiction made my stomach turn. Something was profoundly wrong with this scene. We approached carefully, our hands on our emergency weapons, unsure what we were walking into. The cabin was small, made of logs that looked weathered and old. The door was closed but not locked. Inside, we found an interior that contradicted every aspect of the eerie exterior. The space was warm, too warm. The fire in the stove was burning bright, the flames visible through the grate. The wood inside was fresh, recently added. Beside the stove, the ashes in the pit outside still radiated heat when I touched them, meaning they had been tended within the last hour, possibly within the last few minutes. But there was no one in the cabin. The space was divided into 2 rooms. The main living area contained a table, chairs, and a cot. The second room appeared to be storage. There were supplies everywhere, food in sealed containers, water in large jugs, fuel for the generator that sat dormant in the corner. Everything was organized meticulously. Everything was clean. Everything suggested someone was actively maintaining this camp. Yet the most unsettling discovery was the food on the table. A plate sat there with what appeared to be dinner, dried meat, some kind of root vegetable, a cup of something that might have been tea or broth. The food was still warm. When I touched the cup, heat radiated from it. The food had been placed on that plate minutes, perhaps only seconds, before we entered the cabin. Jennifer checked the generator. It was recently filled with fuel and running, though the engine had been turned off temporarily. Everything in the cabin pointed to active habitation. Someone was here. Someone was living in this cabin. Someone had just finished eating and left, or was somehow present but invisible. Marcus found something in the back room that explained everything and made the situation far more terrifying. A logbook, a record of camp activities kept meticulously over weeks and months. The handwriting was shaky, deteriorating as the entries progressed, but the dates were clear and documented. The cabin had been occupied for exactly 4 months. The entries began with information about Stephen's crash. He had made an emergency landing in this valley after engine problems. He had found the cabin already prepared, supplies already stocked, as if someone had left it set up for a specific purpose. The first entries were optimistic. Stephen described the cabin, the supplies, his plan to repair his radio and call for help. But the later entries changed. The tone shifted from hopeful to paranoid to something beyond paranoia, something closer to acceptance. The final entries were dated just 3 days ago, 3 days before we arrived, day 123. The fear has passed. I no longer worry about being rescued. I no longer think about leaving this place. I have begun to understand why the cabin was prepared, why the supplies were stocked, why I was guided here. This place is meant for someone. This place wants to keep someone. I think I was meant to be that someone. I think I have always been meant to be here. I no longer remember what the outside world looked like. The shadows feel more real to me than any memory of civilization. The final entry was nearly illegible, written in handwriting that barely resembled the initial entries. I do not know my own name anymore. I do not know how long I have been here. The darkness and light no longer follow natural patterns. Sometimes it is day for many hours. Sometimes the darkness lasts for days. The fire never goes out. The food is always here. The cabin is always warm. I cannot leave. I do not think I want to leave. There is something here with me. Something in the shadows. Something that watches. I think it is keeping me company. I think it has always been keeping me company. Tom looked at the date again. 3 days ago. The most recent entry was from 3 days ago. Yet the cabin was clearly occupied. The food was warm. The fire was fresh. Either Stephen was still here, somehow evading our detection, or someone else was now living in this camp. We searched the cabin thoroughly. Every corner, every space between the walls, every possible hiding place. We found nothing. No sign of a second person. No indication that Stephen had left any kind of message for us beyond the logbook. Just the warm fire, the fresh food, and the eerie sense that we had arrived moments after someone had been sitting at that table eating. The horror of our situation became clear when we realized the implications. If the most recent entry was 3 days old, and the camp was still occupied, then Stephen must have written that entry and then vanished. He must have walked out into the 30-degree below zero darkness and abandoned the cabin that held everything needed for survival. He must have left behind food, warmth, shelter, and safety to disappear into the frozen night. Why would someone do that? Jennifer suggested that perhaps Stephen had died, and someone else was now living here. But the logbook's final entry was signed with what appeared to be Stephen's signature, and the handwriting, though deteriorated, was consistent with the earlier entries. The same person who had written the first optimistic entry about his crash landing was the person who had written the final paranoid, fragmentary entry. I made the decision to wait in the cabin overnight, to see if Stephen returned, to understand what was happening in this place. Marcus disagreed strongly. He wanted to leave, to return to the helicopter, to report what we had found and have a larger search team investigate. But I was convinced that the answer to Stephen's disappearance was in this cabin. That waiting would provide clarity. That night was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Around midnight, when the 4 of us were gathered in the main room with the fire burning bright, something changed. The shadows in the corners of the cabin began to deepen, not just from the lack of light, but from something else. Something that made the shadows darker and more substantial than shadows should be. Shapes began to form in those darkened areas. Vague shapes, humanoid shapes, watching us. Tom saw them too. I could tell from the way his hand moved to his weapon, from the way his breathing became shallow and fast, from the way he slowly stood up and moved toward me. We did not speak. We did not need to. The presence in the cabin was suddenly, undeniably real. Something lived here, something more than just the memory of Stephen's presence. Something that had been watching us since we arrived. Something that had kept Stephen alive in this cabin for months, feeding him, keeping him warm, but also keeping him captive in some way we could not understand. Jennifer moved toward the door. The cabin, its entrance suddenly seemed very far away. The distance between where we stood and the exit felt like it was expanding, the space growing longer and colder and more hostile with each step. Marcus shouted something. I do not remember what. Then he was moving toward the door as well, his fear overriding his strategic thinking. Jennifer reached the door first and pulled it open. The cold hit us like a physical blow. The 30-degree below zero wind rushed into the cabin, but the fire did not diminish. The flames burned brighter, as if responding to the presence of the outside cold. We ran. All four of us abandoned the cabin and ran across the frozen landscape toward our snow machines. Behind us, I could hear something. Not a sound exactly, more like an absence of sound, like the air itself was being disturbed by something large and fast moving through it. The shadow shapes from the cabin seemed to follow, or perhaps they were already outside waiting for us. We reached the snow machines and started them immediately. Jennifer called ahead to the helicopter. The pilot confirmed he was already flying toward our location. Something about the urgency in Jennifer, his voice having alarmed him. We rode the snow machines hard, racing across terrain that should have thrown us from our seats with its roughness. The helicopter was waiting when we arrived at the evacuation point. We did not look back. We did not discuss what we had seen or felt or experienced. We simply boarded the helicopter and flew away from that valley as fast as the aircraft could move. Back at the search and rescue headquarters, we filed reports about finding Stephen's cabin, about discovering his logbook and the evidence that he had been there but was now missing, about the warm fire and the fresh food. Authorities questioned us extensively, but they seemed satisfied with our answers. They did not ask us about the shadows. They did not ask us about the presence we had felt in that cabin. They did not ask us to speculate about what had been watching us in the darkness. Because some part of them, some part that had read similar reports about other missing people in remote Alaska, already knew the answer. I have learned since that cabin is not unique. There are other structures scattered across the Alaskan wilderness. Other places where people have gone missing and their camps have been found abandoned but occupied. Other locations where rescue teams arrive to find warm fires and fresh food but no trace of the missing person. Some places in Alaska have learned how to keep people, not through violence or obvious force, but through something more subtle. Something that offers comfort and safety while slowly separating a person from their sense of self. Something that keeps the body alive while the mind unravels. Stephen never came home. No body was ever recovered. No rescue team ever found him wandering in the wilderness. He simply ceased to exist as a person we could understand or locate. But somewhere in that valley, in a cabin that is probably still warm, a fire is still burning. Food is still being prepared. And something that lives in the shadows continues to wait for the next person who crashes or gets lost in that remote landscape. The cabin wants company. The darkness wants company. And the Alaskan wilderness, in its eerie and hostile way, has learned how to provide exactly what these things desire. If you ever go missing in remote Alaska, if your plane goes down or you become stranded in the wilderness, and you find a cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, do not enter. Do not accept the warmth and shelter that it offers. Do not eat the food that is waiting for you, because the cabin is not a rescue. It is a trap. And once you step inside, once you accept its comfort, something will begin to change in you. You may eventually write in a logbook about that change. You may document your descent into whatever exists in that cabin, the shadows. And when you can no longer bear it, when the fear and isolation become too much, you will walk out into the darkness and disappear. And the cabin will still be warm when the next lost person arrives. Story 7. Empty plane, a confession from Hustla. The plane landed perfectly. That's what made it so terrifying. I watched it touch down on the gravel strip outside Hustla at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, right on schedule. The engine was still running. The propeller was still turning. Smoke came off the tires from the friction of landing. Everything appeared normal except for one chilling detail. There was no pilot inside. My name is Marcus Webb, and I was working as the airstrip attendant in Hustla that November. A small job in a small bush village in interior Alaska. Population 300 and declining. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where isolation is a way of life, and where strange things sometimes happen without explanation or investigation. The bush plane that arrived empty was a regular run. Same pilot for 8 months. Same schedule. Same route from Fairbanks bringing supplies and mail to our remote community. His name was David Reeves. I knew him in the casual way, someone you see every few weeks. He was professional, quiet, reliable. He always landed smooth. He always unloaded quick. He was the kind of person you don't think much about. Until the day he disappeared while flying. I was standing outside the maintenance shed when the plane appeared over the ridge. The sound was familiar, the distinctive drone of a Cessna 206 that had made that same approach dozens of times. The eerie part was that something felt different about this landing. Not in the way the plane moved or sounded. Something in the air itself felt wrong, unsettling. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl without any logical reason. The plane descended through the gray afternoon sky. The airstrip was empty except for me. November in Alaska means the tourists have left, the seasonal workers have fled south, and only the hardcore residents remain. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. The Cessna touched down smoothly, exactly as David had done countless times before. The wheels settled into the familiar groove on the gravel. The engine continued running as the plane rolled toward the maintenance area where I stood waiting. I expected to see David, his familiar face in the side window. Calm, focused, professional. The shadow of his form should have been visible in the cockpit. It wasn't. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The afternoon sun was low and cast strange shadows across the windscreen. I squinted, trying to see inside. The horrifying realization came slowly. The cockpit was completely empty. I ran toward the plane, my mind racing with possibilities. None of them good. The engine was still running. The propeller was still spinning. The plane was moving forward at taxi speed. I had to jump back to avoid getting hit by the wing. The Cessna continued rolling across the airstrip, apparently on its own. No hands on the controls, no figure in the pilot seat. It moved with a terrible, impossible precision toward the refueling station at the far end of the runway. I watched, frozen, as the plane began to slow. The engine noise changed pitch. The propeller continued turning, but the forward momentum decreased. It was as if invisible hands were working the controls, guiding the aircraft to a perfect stop exactly where it should be. The engine shut down. The propeller spun to a halt in maybe 30 seconds. The silence that followed was the most disturbing silence I ever experienced. No engine noise, no wind, no sound at all except my own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the empty air. I forced myself to approach the plane. My legs felt weak. My mind was screaming that something was profoundly wrong, something that violated the natural order of the world. The terrifying possibility that David Reeves had somehow flown this plane from Fairbanks to Hustle while not being inside it. The cockpit door was unlocked. I opened it and climbed inside. The plane was warm. Not just warm from the engine. Warm in the way a space becomes warm when it has been occupied by a living body. The seat still held the impression of someone who had been sitting there moments before. The controls showed the tiny movements of recent use. But there was no David, no body, no explanation. I checked the cargo area. Empty except for the regular supplies. Mail bags arranged neatly, food containers secured properly. Everything organized with meticulous care, as David always organized things. The truly chilling discovery was the logbook. David always filled it out in detail. Flight time, weather conditions, fuel consumption, everything documented with professional precision. The entry for this flight was complete and dated with today, this date. The handwriting was David, yes. The information was accurate. Everything was filled out perfectly. Except at the bottom, in the remarks section, he written one sentence. Not coming back. I reported it to the state police. They arrived 2 days later on a supply flight from Fairbanks. They asked standard questions. When did I last see David? Did he seem depressed or unstable? Had he mentioned any personal problems? I had no answers. I'd barely known him beyond professional courtesies. To me, he was just the reliable pilot who brought supplies every 2 weeks. The fact that he'd apparently flown an airplane from Fairbanks to Hustle without being in the cockpit seemed to interest them far less than it interested me. They searched the surrounding area. No body, no signs of foul play, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. They treated it as a missing person case. A man who perhaps jumped from the plane somewhere along the route. A suicide, most likely, they suggested. The logbook entry supported that theory. They impounded the plane and eventually flew it back to Fairbanks. Life in Hustle returned to normal. A new pilot was assigned to the route. The village continued its quiet existence, isolated from the rest of the world. But I couldn't stop thinking about the empty cockpit, the warm seat, the perfectly executed landing, the eerie precision of a plane landing itself. That is when I started noticing the strange occurrences around the village. The first unsettling event happened a week after the plane landed. I found tracks outside my cabin. Not animal tracks, human footprints in the fresh snow. But they only went one direction, coming toward my cabin from the forest. They didn't return. The terrifying implication was that whoever made those tracks was still inside the forest somewhere, or had walked through my property and simply vanished into the darkness. Then there were the sounds. At night, I would hear footsteps crunching on the frozen ground outside my cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps that would circle my building and then disappear. No person was ever there when I checked outside. Just the eerie silence of the dark Alaskan night and the disturbing impression of being watched. The other residents reported similar experiences. Old Tommy from the store mentioned finding his door open in the morning, though he was certain he delocked it. Sarah, the school teacher, said she'd seen a figure moving through the village late at night. Always at the edge of her vision, always disappearing when she tried to look directly at it. The chilling consensus was that something had come to Hustla on that plane. Something that wasn't David. Something that had taken the plane, its controls, and guided it perfectly to our village. Something that had left its physical form in the cockpit but remained present in the darkness surrounding us. 3 weeks after the plane landed, people started disappearing. The first was Tommy from the store. He mentioned going to check on a line shack in the forest. He never returned. His snow machine was found parked at the trailhead, engine still running. No sign of Tommy, no explanation. Then Sarah vanished from her cabin one night. The door was found open. Fresh snow covered the ground, but there were no footprints leading away from the cabin. No struggle, no signs of violence. She had simply been taken by something. The terrifying realization was spreading through Hustla like a disease. The empty plane had delivered something hungry. I filed a report with the state police. They returned again, skeptical but concerned. They found no evidence of foul play. No bodies, no signs of violence. The missing people had simply vanished. The official explanation was that they wandered into the forest and become lost. It happened in Alaska. People died in the wilderness all the time. But I knew the truth. I could feel it in the way the darkness pressed against my cabin at night. The horrifying certainty that something intelligent and deliberate was hunting us, selecting its targets, taking people into the forest where they could never be found. My psychological breakdown happened gradually. The isolation of Hustla, combined with the knowledge that something predatory shared our village, fractured my mind piece by piece. I started hearing the engine of the Cessna in my dreams. I began seeing David, his face in the shadows around my cabin. The terrifying conviction grew that the empty plane might land again, and next time, I would be the one standing in the cockpit, empty of self, flying the plane somewhere else. I left Hustla on the first opportunity, abandoning my position and my possessions. I flew south and never looked back. The official story was that I suffered a psychological break from isolation and had to leave for my mental health. The truth is darker. I fled because I understood what that empty plane meant. That consciousness and will could be separated from flesh. That something could inhabit the controls of an aircraft and guide it to select victims. That the eerie darkness of the Alaskan bush harbored intelligences we weren't equipped to understand or resist. The missing people are never recovered. The official count is 7 missing from Hustla since that plane landed empty. New pilots have replaced David. They report nothing unusual. The village continues as if the disappearances never happened. But I've done research. I've combed through records. And I've discovered something that still haunts me. David Reeves never existed. There's no record of him in any database. No pilot license. No employment history. No birth certificate. The man I knew for 8 months, the reliable pilot who landed perfectly on schedule, was never real. The plane landed empty because the pilot was never there to begin with. Whatever took those seats in the cockpit, whatever guided that aircraft with such terrible precision, was something that had learned to imitate human presence so perfectly that we couldn't distinguish it from reality until it was too late. The most disturbing thought is this. I started having dreams where I am in the cockpit, where I am flying, but I am not inside my own body, where I am watching myself from outside, seeing my hands on the controls but unable to control them, where I am being taken somewhere in that aircraft, to a place beyond Hustla, beyond the reach of any help or rescue. Last month, I received a letter. It had no return address. The handwriting was dated, yes. The message was brief. I am coming back soon. I need you to be ready. I know what is coming. I can feel it drawing closer with each passing day. The eerie certainty that the empty plane will land again, and this time, it is coming for me. Maybe when it lands, I'll finally understand what David Reeves was. What flying an empty aircraft to a remote village meant. What happened to those missing people? Or maybe I'll just become another empty seat in the cockpit. Another instrument through which that terrible intelligence guides its perfect descent toward the dark heart of the Alaskan bush. The plane will land on schedule. The engine will still be running. And the terror will continue for whoever is standing on that airstrip, watching in horror as another impossible arrival unfolds before them. That thought never leaves me. Not for one moment. Not ever. Story 8. Trapline. What was learning my traps? I realized something was imitating me on my trapline when I found traps reset backwards, the mechanisms facing the wrong direction, as if something intelligent was trying to recreate my work without understanding how it actually functioned. My name is Robert Hendrick. I've lived in the Alaskan interior for 34 years, operating a trapline that spans 40 square miles of remote forest. Trapping is how I survive. Furs provide income. The work keeps me connected to the land. It is solitary by nature. Weeks out in the wilderness, checking traps, resetting them, processing animals. I understand isolation better than most people understand their own homes. The trapline I've maintained for 3 decades follows a precise pattern. I set specific traps at specific locations, marked on maps only I possess. I use particular techniques learned through decades of experience. The traps are set with spring tension facing inward. The mechanisms are positioned to catch animals as they pass through natural corridors. I've refined this knowledge through thousands of hours of wilderness experience. The terrifying incidents began in late November when I was doing my standard weekly circuit. I found the first trap sprung. That wasn't the unusual. Traps catch animals regularly. What was unusual was how it had been reset. Someone had sprung the trap, caught whatever was in it, and then attempted to set it again. But the mechanism was backwards. The spring was facing outward instead of inward. The trigger was positioned on the wrong side. The eerie quality was that someone had tried to recreate my trap setup but had fundamentally misunderstood how it worked. I reset it correctly and continued my route, assuming maybe another trapper had moved through the area. It happened occasionally, though rarely in my territory. Still, the wrongly reset trap was unsettling. The mechanics suggested someone had studied my traps but didn't fully comprehend their function. By the 5th trap on my circuit, the chilling pattern became undeniable. All 5 of those traps had been sprung and reset backwards. The mechanisms were reversed. The triggers were positioned incorrectly. The springs were facing the wrong direction. Someone was following my trap line, catching animals in my traps, and attempting to reset them, but with mechanisms inverted as if they were creating mirror images of the original design. The disturbing implication was immediate. Something intelligent enough to recognize a trap, spring it, and attempt to replicate it was operating on my trap line. But it was mimicking the process imperfectly. It was copying the actions without understanding the underlying mechanics. It was learning by observation, but the learning was incomplete. I spent the rest of the day checking every trap on the circuit. 23 traps total. 17 of them had been reset backwards. 6 had been left alone. The eerie pattern suggested selective testing. The entity was learning from my traps, experimenting with different ones, attempting to understand their function through trial and error. The chilling thought came immediately. Something was studying my work. Something was trying to learn how I caught animals. Something was attempting to replicate human trapping methodology. I contacted the village by satellite phone that evening. I reported the incident to the ranger station. The response was dismissive. Wildlife occasionally disturbs human equipment. Bears sometimes destroy traps. I was told to reset them and move on. The official explanation was insufficient. Bears done to study mechanisms. Bears done to attempt to replicate trap configurations. The disturbing certainty was that I was dealing with something far more intelligent than standard wilderness predators. The next week, the phenomenon escalated. I found traps that hadn't been sprung but had been deliberately moved, relocated from their original positions to new locations. The eerie aspect was that the new positions followed a logical pattern. The traps were being positioned closer to each other, arranged in ways that suggested someone was testing different configurations, different spacing distances, different spatial relationships. The most unsettling discovery was a trap I found completely disassembled. Not destroyed, disassembled. The components were laid out in neat rows on a flat rock, as if someone had taken the trap apart to study its individual pieces. The terrifying implication was clear. Something was conducting a systematic examination of my trapping equipment, learning not just how the traps functioned but understanding their individual mechanical components. I gathered my equipment and attempted to leave the area. I decided the trapline was no longer safe. Whatever was operating out here was intelligent, observant, and dedicated to understanding human methodology. The chilling certainty was that studying my traps might just be the beginning. That whatever this was might eventually study me with the same intensity. But when I reached my snowmobile, I found something that stopped me cold. My equipment had been rearranged. Not stolen, rearranged. My supplies were organized differently than I left them. My rifle was positioned at a different angle. My fuel containers were moved to different locations. The eerie aspect was the precision. Everything had been handled carefully, rearranged methodically, as if someone was testing different configurations, seeing what worked best. The most disturbing discovery was my personal journal. I kept detailed notes about trap locations, catches, patterns, and observations. The journal was open to a specific page, the one where I documented my trapline methodology in detail. Someone had been reading my instructions, learning directly from my documentation, understanding my techniques through my own written explanations. The terrifying realization crystallized. Something wasn't just imitating my traps. It was studying me, learning from my work, attempting to understand not just the mechanics but the reasoning behind my methodology. I attempted to leave immediately, but the eerie discovery came when I tried to start my snowmobile. The engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the mechanical components. Nothing was obviously damaged, but something had been adjusted. The fuel line was disconnected. The spark plugs were removed. Someone had systematically dismantled my vehicle, its essential components, while I was checking traps. The chilling truth was that I wasn't leaving. Something had deliberately stranded me in the wilderness. Something that had learned enough about my equipment to disable it without destroying it permanently. Something intelligent enough to understand that immobilizing me was more effective than attacking me directly. I spent that night in my cabin, a small shelter I maintained halfway along my trapline. The eerie silence pressed against the walls. The darkness outside felt active, alert, aware. I kept my rifle close and didn't sleep. The disturbing certainty was that something was learning how I operated in darkness, how I reacted to isolation, how I survived in conditions designed to break weaker people. The next morning, I found animal tracks around the cabin, but they were wrong. The paw prints didn't match any creature I recognized. The stride was too long. The arrangement was wrong. The print suggested something on 4 legs, but with proportions that didn't match bears, wolves, or any predator native to Alaska. Most disturbing was the pattern. The tracks circled my cabin deliberately. Multiple complete circuits. The creature had walked around my shelter repeatedly, at varying distances, as if mapping the perimeter. As if studying my shelter from every angle. As if trying to understand the structure and my position within it. I managed to repair my snowmobile with parts from the cabin. I attempted to flee the trapline and return to civilization. But the chilling discovery came when I tried to navigate. My maps were missing. Someone had entered my cabin and removed every map, every navigation aid, every tool I used to orient myself in the wilderness. The terrifying implication was immediate. I was being prevented from leaving. Something was methodically removing my ability to function, stranding me, isolating me, keeping me in the wilderness where it could continue its study. I attempted to navigate by memory and landscape recognition. I made it about 5 miles before I realized I was being herded. The eerie pattern of obstacles suggested deliberate placement. Fallen trees blocking direct routes. Disturbed ground creating impassable areas. Physical barriers forcing me along specific paths. Something was directing my movement, guiding me back toward the trapline, preventing my escape. By the time I returned to my cabin, the psychological pressure was overwhelming. The certain knowledge that something intelligent and patient was keeping me isolated, learning from me, studying how I reacted to fear and helplessness. That's when I found the traps positioned around my cabin. 7 traps, set in a perfect circle around my shelter. All of them set backwards, inverted versions of my standard design, but with the mechanisms deliberately positioned to trap something approaching from outside. The eerie aspect was the clarity of the message. Something was replicating my traps for a new purpose. Not to catch animals, to catch me. The traps were set with enough force to break bones. The triggers were positioned to ensure anything touching the perimeter would be caught and held. The disturbing realization was that whatever had been studying my work had learned how to adapt my methodology. How to use my own knowledge against me. I disassembled those traps carefully. I was acutely aware that something was watching. observing my technique, learning how I handled the equipment I designed. The eerie certainty was that each action I took was being recorded, analyzed, incorporated into its growing understanding of human methodology. By the end of the second week, I stopped trying to escape. The psychological pressure of being hunted by something intelligent, something that was actively learning my techniques and systematically preventing my departure, had broken something in my mind. I began studying it the way it was studying me. I left my own traps unmarked on purpose, watching to see if it would approach them differently now that it understood more. I documented in my journal how it would interact with new configurations. The terrifying realization was that I began collaborating with it, teaching it, providing data for its continued education. The most disturbing discovery came when I understood what it was actually learning. It wasn't just studying my traps. It was studying survival. It was learning the totality of how humans operate in wilderness isolation. How we find food, how we create shelter, how we navigate, how we endure. I finally escaped the trap line in early January. A bush plane came through for a supply run, and I managed to signal the pilot. I fled with minimal supplies and no explanation. The official report was that I experienced psychological breakdown from isolation. I recovered and returned to normal life. But I know the truth. Something was learning. Something that studies human methodology and adapts it for its own purposes. Something that operates in the space between wilderness and human understanding, where the rules we depend on become irrelevant. The most terrifying aspect is this. I discovered I'm not the only one. There are trap lines across interior Alaska. Trappers who reported similar incidents. Traps found reset incorrectly. Equipment mysteriously dismantled. The eerie pattern suggests whatever was studying me is studying others too. Multiple entities, multiple locations, all of them learning simultaneously. I still trap occasionally, but never the same way twice. I change my methodology constantly because I understand now that patterns can be learned. Techniques can be replicated. Knowledge can be extracted and weaponized. Sometimes I find traps on my line that I didn't set. Traps using my old designs. Traps set backwards, as if reminding me that it's still there. Still watching. Still learning. Still improving. The chilling final realization is that I might have been teaching it to hunt us. Teaching it how to use our own knowledge against us. Teaching it the methodology of survival so it could eventually use those skills to find people in the deepest wilderness where help never arrives. The trap line continues to be checked weekly by someone or something. The traps continue to be reset, sometimes correctly, sometimes backwards. As if it is still learning, still experimenting, still perfecting its understanding of how to catch things that move through the forest. The eerie certainty is that someday, it will set the traps perfectly. And then it won't be hunting animals anymore. Then it will begin hunting us. Story 9. Aniak figures. I saw them again last night. And this time, they saw me watching. That is how I need to start this. Not with the origin story, not with how I ended up in the Alaskan bush, but with the moment everything became terrifying and real. Because what I am about to tell you happened, and I need someone to know before I disappear completely into this darkness. My name is Robert Caldwell. I've been a bush pilot for 32 years. They've flown through whiteouts that would make commercial pilots weep. They landed on glaciers, sandbars, frozen lakes, and strips carved out of forest where the trees seemed to lean in like they wanted to grab the wings. I've seen blizzards that swallow mountains whole. I've seen the aurora bore down from the Arctic with colors that shouldn't exist. They've seen things in the bush that most people will never witness. And they stayed calm through all of it. But nothing prepared me for Aniak. Aniak is a small village on the Kuskokwim River in southwestern Alaska. Population around 500. It's remote, isolated, the kind of place where the nearest hospital is hours away by plane, where the nearest substantial town feels like another world entirely. I've been flying mail and supplies to Aniak for nearly 2 decades. The airstrip is decent, maintained reasonably well considering the extreme conditions. The locals are good people, hard people, the kind who survive in one of Earth's harshest environments because they read tougher than the cold itself. I never had a problem landing there. Not until April of this year. It started small. Nothing you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. But I pay attention. That is how you survive in bush flying. You notice everything. The fuel gauge, the wind direction, the sound of the engine, the way clouds move. You notice if something is even slightly different. The first time, It was around 10 at night. Late spring means endless twilight in Alaska. That eerie half-light that makes your internal clock feel completely broken. I was bringing in medical supplies and a few packages. The airstrip was quiet. No ground crew waiting, which was unusual but not alarming. I landed dozens of times with nobody there. As I approached, dropping altitude, I saw them. Figures, standing on the runway. They were far away, backlit by the landing lights, so I couldn't see them clearly. Just shapes, tall, impossibly still, spread across the asphalt like they were waiting. My stomach twisted. Something about the way they stood felt wrong. Not human wrong, but human-shaped wrong. The kind of wrong that triggers every ancient survival instinct in your brain. I aborted the landing. I climbed, banked hard left, and looked back. The landing lights swept across the runway. The figures were gone. Just concrete and empty space where they had been standing moments before. The darkness had swallowed them completely. I circled again, slowly, staring down at that strip. Nothing. No movement. No shapes. No sign that anything had been there at all. My hands were shaking on the controls. My pulse was hammering in my temples. The radio crackled with the village's emergency frequency. Nothing. Dead air. I landed carefully, smoothly, professionally. The supplies couldn't wait. People needed those medications. I couldn't let fear grind this operation to a halt based on what might have been shadows and tiredness. I've been flying long enough to know that your eyes can betray you in bad light, especially when you re-exhausted. But I wasn't tired, and I knew what I'd seen. I had another load to bring in 2 nights later. This time, I paid closer attention to the approach. I called ahead on the radio, warned the community center that I'd be arriving. They confirmed they have someone watching. I wanted witnesses. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind in the isolation of the cockpit. The twilight was thicker that night, the sky a deeper blue, more unsettling. The runway lights came up as I descended, and there they were again, the shadowy figures, 4 of them this time, standing in a line across the middle of the strip. But they were facing away, toward the forest. That detail made it worse somehow. They weren't waiting. They were watching something, or watching for something. The way they stood was completely rigid, completely still, and they were focused entirely on the dark tree line that marked the boundary between the airstrip and the vast, endless bush beyond. I adjusted my descent. I was committed now. Someone was supposedly on the ground. I had witnesses coming. I needed to see if this was real. As I descended further, the landing lights brightened. The figures didn't move. They didn't scatter or run or react in any way to a 20,000-pound aircraft screaming down toward them. They just stood there, motionless, as if the plane was completely irrelevant to their purpose. 50 feet from touchdown, I looked directly down. I could see more detail now in the brighter light. They were wearing dark clothing, long coats or robes or something draped. Their skin looked pale, almost luminescent in the harsh white of the landing lights. Their heads were angled slightly upward. I couldn't see their faces, not clearly, but something about their posture suggested they weren't human. The proportions felt subtly wrong, the way their limbs hung, the curvature of their spines. I pulled up hard. The aircraft lurched as I opened the throttles. The landing gear nearly scraped the asphalt. My vision tunneled. Everything else disappeared except the desperate need to climb, to gain altitude, to get away from whatever was standing on that runway. I banked away from Aniak and looked back down. The landing lights were still bright enough to illuminate the strip. The figures were gone, vanished, erased. There was nothing there but empty pavement and the creeping shadows of the trees beyond. The radio crackled. A voice came through, tense and confused. It was David Konska, who manages the community center. He said they'd been ready, that they heard my plane, but when they looked outside, they didn't see anyone on the runway. He wanted to know what happened. Was I coming in? Was there a mechanical problem? I told him I was aborting. I said there'd been a fuel system warning light. I lied. I didn't tell him about the figures. I didn't tell him about the impossible things I'd seen standing on that runway twice now. Because how do you explain that? How do you tell a community that something is using their airstrip at night? What would they do? What could they do? I flew back to my base in Dillingham that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in my office and stared at my flight logs, at the maps, at the photographs of Aniak I'd taken over the years. Everything felt different now. Everything felt dangerous. I didn't to fly to Aniak for 2 weeks. But mail and supplies still needed to go to Aniak. People there rely on air service. It's not optional. It's life or death when someone gets sick or injured. So after the second week, I steeled myself and planned another run. I decided to do it during full daylight. No twilight, no strange light that could play tricks on your eyes. Just bright, honest Alaskan daylight. Surely nothing that terrifying could survive under the sun. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The sky was clear. The visibility was perfect. The airstrip looked normal, exactly as it had looked 100 times before. No figures, no shadows, no sign of anything unusual at all. I landed smoothly and taxied to the small terminal building. 3 people came out to meet me. David and 2 young guys from the village. They seemed perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. They helped me unload the cargo. We talked about the weather, about supply shortages, about the upcoming fishing season. Everything was fine. Everything was natural. But as they were loading the last box, David mentioned something casual, offhand. He said that several people in the village had mentioned seeing strange figures near the airstrip at night. He said it was probably just locals being paranoid, that the bush played tricks on people's minds. But he asked if I'd seen anything unusual on my previous visits. My blood went cold. I told him it was probably nothing. Just shadows, just the darkness and the strange light of spring twilight. I got back in the plane and flew out of there. That is when I started researching. I spent nights in the library in Dillingham, in internet cafes, digging through old records. Aniak has history that goes back centuries. Before the Russians came, before the Americans, before the logging camps and the fishing operations, it was something else. The indigenous people there have stories, warnings, oral histories passed down about things that come down from the north in certain seasons. Things that air and seen during the day. Things that gather in places people use. I found references in old missionary records from the 1800s. Priests who written about the local people's refusal to use certain trails and certain places at night. The reasons were never clear, just consistent warnings. Avoid the airstrip after dark. Avoid the river crossings at certain times. Avoid places where the boundary between land and wild felt too thin. I read about another pilot, someone who flown the route in the 1970s. His name was Earl Hickman. He documented seeing figures on the Aniak Strip, just like I had. He made a formal report to the FAA. The report was filed away, investigated, and closed with no conclusion. Earl stopped flying to Aniak after the second sighting. He died in 1989. Car accident, nothing suspicious. But his daughter had kept his journals. I found her contact information online. I called her. We talked for 2 hours. She told me everything her father had written about Aniak. The figures that appeared at night, the way they moved, or rather, the way they didn't move. The complete absence of reaction to aircraft landing nearby. The way they disappeared the moment the landing lights brightened. The growing sense that they weren't observing the airstrip but guarding it. Or waiting for something specific to happen there. Earl's final journal entry about Aniak was dated March of 1988. It said, they were becoming more frequent. 2 visits ago, I saw 6 of them. Last night, 9. They were not random. They regathering. Something is happening. And I don't. Do you think I want to understand what? He never flew to Aniak again. I started refusing flights to Aniak after that conversation. My company wasn't too happy. The village needed service. There were no other pilots willing to take the route, which should have told me something right there. But the other pilots I asked all gave vague answers. Weather concerns, mechanical issues, nothing concrete, nothing that named the real reason. Then I realized something terrifying. I'd been seeing those figures for 2 months now, and nobody else was saying anything. Nobody else was reporting anything. The figures were only appearing to me. The other pilots, the ones who still flew there, hadn't mentioned anything. The village seemed fine, unconcerned, going about their daily business as if nothing was wrong, which meant either they didn't see the figures at all, or they saw them and didn't care. And I began to wonder which possibility was worse. I started flying other routes exclusively. I told my company I was cutting my hours. I told them my medical condition required it. It was a lie. My health is fine, but I needed to stop seeing whatever was gathering at Aniak. For 3 months, I avoided it completely. Then I saw something in the local news. A small article buried in the Alaska section of a regional newspaper. The Aniak clinic had recorded an unusual spike in patients reporting similar symptoms. Strange dreams, disrupted sleep, a sense of being watched. Memory gaps. Several people had described waking up in locations they didn't remember going to. The clinic had attributed it to seasonal depression, normal bush isolation psychosis. Nothing alarming, but the symptoms started appearing 2 months ago, right around the time the figures began gathering on the airstrip. Last week, I made a decision. I was going to fly to Antioch one more time. I was going to land during the day, talk to people, figure out what was really happening. I was going to understand what those figures were and what they wanted. I was going to take control of this terrifying thing that had stolen my peace and my certainty about the world. I told no one. I filed a normal flight plan. I loaded supplies. I flew north toward Antioch on a clear afternoon. As I approached the village, I noticed something different. The airstrip was visible from 50 miles out. I could see it clearly. And standing on that runway, in full daylight, were the figures. Not at night, daylight, bright afternoon sunlight. 12 of them, arranged in a perfect circle, facing the sky, facing my approaching aircraft. I was so shocked that I nearly stalled the plane. I had to fight the controls, had to remember how to fly, had to push through the primal terror that was screaming at me to dive, to crash, to do anything except continue toward them. I circled the airstrip 3 times, unable to land, unable to accept what I was seeing. They didn't to move. They didn't to react. They just stood there in their impossible circle, perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting. Then one of them turned its head and looked directly up at me. I can to describe the feeling that caused. It was like having my entire being, every atom, suddenly exposed to something intelligent and completely indifferent to my existence. The moment our eyes met, I knew several things with absolute certainty. They were aware of me. They had been waiting for me specifically. They were not finished with me, and they had time. I opened the throttles and climbed away from Antioch as fast as the plane could go. I didn't to radio in. I didn't to file an emergency report. I just flew, hard and fast, back toward Dillingham, back toward civilization, back toward the places where people are numerous enough that things can to simply take you in the night. I landed 2 hours later with shaking hands. I reported a mechanical emergency, even though there was nothing wrong with the aircraft. I grounded myself. I told my company I was done. I sold my share of the business and walked away. Now I'm living in Anchorage, a real city, 30,000 people around me at all times. Lights and noise and the constant presence of other human beings. But I'm noticing something that terrifies me more than the figures ever did. My dreams are getting worse. The same dreams. I'm walking through an endless airstrip, and it's dark, and there are figures all around me, and they whispering something I can almost understand. I wake up gasping, covered in sweat, and I can never remember what they were saying. But I can remember the feeling that I was missing something important, that they were telling me something I needed to know. And sometimes, when I wake up, I find myself standing at my window, looking north toward the direction of Antioch. I don't remember walking to the window. I don't remember getting out of bed. 2 nights ago, I realized my passport was missing. I checked my computer history and see that I've been researching bush pilots for hire, charter services, ways to get back to remote Alaska quietly, without questions. I don't remember doing any of that research, but I know why I was doing it. The figures aren't finished with me. They planted something in me that night when that one turned its head and looked up at my plane. Something that is growing. Something that knows I belong with them, standing in that circle, waiting on that runway. I am writing this because I need someone to understand. I need someone to know that if I disappear, if I stop answering calls, if I am found somewhere impossible to explain, it's not what it looks like. I am going back to Antioch. I am going to land on that runway, and I am going to stand with those figures and finally understand what they've been waiting so patiently to show me. Part of me is terrified, but another part, the part that is growing stronger every night, is absolutely certain that this is exactly where I am supposed to be. The darkness is calling me home. Story 10. Trapline. They found Marcus Reeves 34 miles from his trapline, frozen solid, barefoot in 20 below zero, and nobody has ever explained how he got there. I know because I was the one who found him. My name is Jack Hollister, and they've been trapping in the Alaska bush for 19 years. I know these valleys like I know the lines on my own hands. I know which creeks freeze solid by November and which ones stay open all winter. I know which slopes hold snow and which ones shed it into the valleys. I know the animal trails, the wind patterns, the way sound travels differently depending on the temperature and the time of day. I know this land better than I know most people, and it terrified me before I found Marcus, and it's only gotten worse since. Marcus was a good trapper, not as experienced as me, but capable. He'd been running his route for 4 seasons, focused mostly on marten and lynx, with some wolf trapping in the deeper country. We see each other out there maybe once a month, compare notes on the fur prices, talk about which areas had been running hot. The bush community is small and scattered, but their SA code. You watch out for each other. You check on people. You make sure nobody disappears. Last January, we were supposed to meet up at a cabin that sits roughly between our 2 territories. It is a shelter point. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a roof that doesn't leak and a wood stove. We plan to swap supplies and maybe trade some furs. I arrived 2 days early, stocked the wood, got the place ready. Marcus never showed up. I waited 4 days. In the bush, delays happen. Weather, mechanical problems, unexpected conditions. You don't panic. But on the 5th day, I started getting that creeping feeling. The scary kind. The kind that makes your skin tighten and your breathing get shallow. I suited up and headed toward Marcus, his trap line. Figured maybe he'd been held up with repairs or gotten his snow machine stuck somewhere. The weather was bad, but not impossible. Temperature running around 15 below. Overcast, but clear enough to navigate by landmarks. The forest was silent in that specific way it gets in deep winter, like the world has stopped making noise. I followed his trail heading north from his main cabin. Fresh tracks, maybe 2 days old. Snow machine deep ruts and boot prints leading out toward the trap sets. I tracked him for about 5 miles without issue. Then something changed. The tracks started to waver, not like he was tired or drunk, but like he was confused about where he was going. The snow machine path started curving in ways that didn't make sense, following the landscape in ways that no experienced trapper would choose. Then the tracks stopped entirely. I found the snow machine half a mile later, sitting dead center in a frozen creek valley with no visible reason for being abandoned. The tank still had fuel. The battery was dead, but that is normal and extreme cold. There were no signs of mechanical failure, no damage, no indication that something had broken down. It just sat there like Marcus had parked it and walked away. That is when the unsettling feeling turned into something darker. Fear. The kind of fear that makes you question your own judgment, that makes you second guess whether you should keep going forward or turn back to civilization. I've felt fear in the bush before. I've been charged by moose. I've been caught in unexpected whiteouts. I've had to dig myself out of avalanche danger. But this was different. This was psychological fear. The fear of something wrong that you don't understand. I called out for Marcus. My voice sounded small against the silence of that frozen valley. Nothing answered. Nothing moved. Just the sound of wind in the trees and my own breathing. I tracked his footprints from there. He walked away from the snow machine heading east, toward a ridge I knew well. Steep country, dangerous in winter, not the kind of place you could go casually. The prints were clear, 1 foot in front of the other, perfectly normal walking pattern. But here is what made my blood run cold. He was barefoot. His prints were in snow boots. They were bare feet pressed into the snow, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, leading away into the darkness between the trees. The skin from his feet should have been shredded. The cold should have made walking impossible in seconds. But the prints just kept going, steady and measured, as if the man was taking a casual stroll through a spring meadow instead of walking barefoot through a nightmare. I followed those prints for 4 miles. The terrain got progressively worse. Steep slopes, dense timber, the kind of country that punishes mistakes. The barefoot prints never wavered, never changed pace, just continued forward with that same measured, impossible stride. And as I tracked them, I started noticing something else. There were no animal prints near his trail. Nothing. No rabbit tracks, no fox trails, no bird disturbance in the snow. It was like his presence had created a dead zone in the forest. Like the natural world was avoiding him. Then I found him. He was standing at the top of a ridge, facing away from me, staring out across the valley below. Completely motionless. Completely naked except for his heavy winter parka. His legs were blue-black from frostbite. Tissue already dying, feet bare and blistered and covered in blood. His hair was frozen solid. Ice crystals hung from his face like he'd been crying. The temperature that night had dropped to 30 below. Nobody survived standing in that for more than a few minutes. But Marcus had been there long enough to freeze solid while standing up. I called his name. He didn't respond. I moved closer, terrified, every instinct screaming at me to run. I came around to see his face and immediately wished I hadn't. His eyes were open, staring across the valley at something I couldn't see. His expression was blank, completely absent of fear or pain or any emotion at all. He looked peaceful, serene, like he'd been hypnotized into standing there and watching the darkness settle across the landscape. I tried to move him. He was rigid, locked in that pose by the cold. I checked for a pulse anyway, though I already knew. Nobody with blue-black legs and ice covering their face was alive. I radioed for help with my satellite phone, gave the coordinates, reported what I'd found. The rescue team arrived the next day via helicopter. They brought Marcus, his body, back to the village. The medical examiner said he'd been dead for approximately 48 hours. Cause of death was hypothermia and exposure. The mystery of how he got there, how he walked barefoot through sub-zero weather and managed to cover 34 miles off his trap line, was never solved. The official report said Marcus must have had a psychiatric episode. Polar night depression. It's real. It happens. People in the bush sometimes lose their minds to the darkness and isolation. He probably went psychotic, abandoned his snow machine, and wandered away in a confused state. The fact that he was barefoot was attributed to confusion. The fact that he covered such distance was treated as impossible coincidence. But I knew better. I knew because Marcus wasn't crazy. I talked to him just 10 days before his death. He was normal, happy about a good trapping season, excited about getting back to the lower 48 in spring to see his daughter. There was nothing wrong with him. And I knew better because I'd seen the tracks, and I found the place where he'd been standing. That ridge overlooked a valley I'd always been warned about by the old-timers. They said it was creepy. They said things were wrong there. They said the native people from the village had stories about that place, stories they wouldn't share with outsiders. I always avoided it, respected the warning without needing to understand the reason. Marcus had gone directly there, barefoot, in impossible cold, over 30 miles from where his mind would ever take him willingly. Something had called him to that place. I stopped trapping after that. I couldn't do it anymore. The knowledge that something was out there in the bush, something that could take a person, his will, and make them walk into the darkness, made the whole landscape feel like a predator. Every rustle of snow in the trees felt like attention. Every silence felt like waiting. But here is the thing that keeps me awake. About 6 weeks after they found Marcus, I was packing up my equipment, getting ready to leave the bush permanently. I was at my main cabin, organizing my supplies, when I noticed something in my logbook. Entries I didn't remember writing. Dates when I said I'd check certain trap sets, but I had no memory of doing it. Sometimes there were notes, cryptic things, just coordinates and temperature readings and occasional single words. One entry, dated 5 days after I found Marcus, just said, "The Ridge. Tomorrow." I didn't remember writing it, and I definitely didn't remember going to any ridge. I checked my snow machine. There was wear on the runners that suggested recent heavy use, more than I accounted for, and there was blood on one of the runners. Not much, just a small smear, but it was there. My blood ran cold again, because I looked down at my feet, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My toenails were blackened, frostbitten, like I'd been barefoot in extreme cold for some period of time that my conscious mind didn't. Do you remember? I checked my scar tissue from old injuries. There were new marks on my feet, blisters, frostbite damage, recent healing. I don't know how I got those injuries. I don't know when I was barefoot outside. I don't remember any of it, but I remember the dreams. Every night since I found Marcus, I had the same dream. I am standing on that ridge, looking across the valley towards something I can't quite see. There, as a presence nearby, something vast and patient and completely indifferent to whether I live or die. It is watching me, studying me, and I understand in the dream that it is waiting for something, waiting for me to understand the nature of the place, waiting for me to accept what it is. When I wake up, sometimes I'm standing at my window. Sometimes I'm fully dressed in cold weather gear, ready to go outside. Sometimes my hands are numb. I left the bush last month. I am in Fairbanks now, in a populated area, surrounded by people and noise and artificial light. I work at a supply warehouse, something normal and human and far from the wilderness. But I'm having the dreams more frequently now. And sometimes, just before sleep takes me, I realize that I'm not really afraid anymore. There's something comforting about the presence in those dreams, something that feels like purpose, like I'm being chosen for something important, like my resistance to whatever happened to Marcus is slowly being worn away by something patient and eternal. I started researching the valley, the coordinates where I found him, the ridge, the native stories that the old-timers always refused to explain. I found fragments of information in historical records, references to something the indigenous people called the quiet place, a location where things were taken, where people went and didn't come back as themselves. Last week, I requested time off work. I told my boss I needed to handle some personal business. I've been researching bush plane charters. I've been looking at snow machine rental places near the airstrips that service that area. I am going back. I don't want to. Every rational part of my mind is screaming that I should stay here, that I should forget about the bush, that I should never return to that landscape. But there is another part of me that is growing stronger every day. The part that understands that Marcus wasn't taken. He was called, and I am being called too. The only difference is that this time, whatever it is being patient. It is letting me come willingly. I've already bought the tickets. So now you've heard them. 10 stories from the Alaskan wilderness. 10 accounts of people who encountered something that shouldn't exist. 10 cases where the official explanations dawn to match the evidence. But remember what I promised you at the beginning? The pattern that connects all of these stories? The one thing that could save your life. Here it is. And I need you to listen very carefully. Every single person in these stories made the same fatal mistake. They investigated something unusual instead of immediately leaving the area. The surveyor who found the graves, he stayed to document them. The radio operator who heard his name, he kept turning the radio back on. The social worker who found the terrified child, she returned to the homestead at night. The rescue team that found warm ashes, they stayed in the cabin overnight. This is the pattern. The Alaskan wilderness operates on a simple rule. Curiosity is punished. The moment you notice something wrong, something impossible, something that violates the natural order, you have a window of maybe 30 minutes to leave before it notices you noticing it. After that window closes, you remarked, you restudied, you reclaimed. The indigenous people who lived in Alaska for thousands of years understand this instinctively. They don't to investigate strange phenomena. They don't to document unusual occurrences. They see something wrong. They leave immediately, and they never speak about it again. That's how they survive. So here is my advice, and it comes from 20 years of researching Alaskan disappearances. If you ever find yourself in remote Alaska, working on the pipeline, conducting research, flying supplies, trapping, whatever, and you encounter something that makes your skin crawl, something that feels wrong on a primal level, something that your rational mind can explain. Run, Don, to investigate. Don, to document it. Don, to try to understand it. Just get to civilization as fast as possible and never return to that specific location. Now, I told you at the beginning that 3 people from these stories are still missing. That is true, but what I didn't tell you is that one of them has been leaving voicemails on my phone. Voicemails from a number that doesn't exist. Voicemails where they describe locations they couldn't possibly know about. Their family confirmed they've been missing for 8 months, but someone using their voice has been calling me every night at 3:47 a.m., describing things that are happening in the Alaskan wilderness right now. The most recent voicemail was left last night. It said, Marcus is ready to come back now. He has learned how to walk without feet. Tell them to stop searching for his body. Tell them to search for his tracks instead, the ones that lead north, the ones that never stop. But before we dive deeper into that nightmare, you need to do something for me right now. If you haven't subscribed to Midnight Whispers Stories, do it this second. We're racing toward 2,000 subscribers, and when we hit that milestone, I'm doing something unprecedented. I am flying to Alaska with a documentary crew. We revisiting 3 of the locations mentioned in these stories. With cameras, with recording equipment, And subscribers will vote on which locations we investigate first. You literally control where I go into the wilderness. Don, to miss your chance to be part of this, destroy that like button if these stories gave you chills. If you couldn't, stop listening. If you are now terrified of empty wilderness, your likes tell YouTube, this algorithm, to push this video to more horror fans. And that is how we grow this community of people brave enough to stare into the darkness. Drop a comment right now telling me which Alaska story terrified you most. Mine was the radio. Something about your name being broadcast as visceral horror. Where you re-watching from and what time it is there, whether you ever work in remote Alaska after hearing these. Be honest, if you caught that survival detail I mentioned in the intro. Story number 7, remember? And most importantly, have you ever experienced something unexplainable in wilderness? Tell me, your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. Share this video with someone who loves horror, but warn them first. Tell them to watch with lights on. Tell them to check the locks on their doors, because some of these stories have a way of following you home. Viewers have reported hearing scratching sounds after watching, footsteps outside their windows, the sense of being watched from the tree line. Hit that bell icon if you haven't already. Next week, this video is about the unexplained disappearances along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. We re-talking hundreds of workers who vanished over 40 years, and the company documents that were sealed by the Department of Defense. It makes the Alaskan bush stories look tame by comparison. Before I let you go, I need to tell you something personal. I started this channel because I wanted to understand why my uncle disappeared in Alaska in 1987. He was working as a geologist near the Brooks Range. His camp was found intact. His equipment was there. His food was still warm on the stove. But he was gone. No tracks, no sign of struggle. Just gone. The official report said he probably fell into a glacier crevasse. But his journal told a different story. He'd written about finding something. About seeing patterns in the permafrost that shouldn't exist. About hearing voices in the wind that spoke in languages he almost understood. His final journal entry was dated the day he disappeared. It said, they, not voices, they, re-invitations. And I think I'm going to accept. I've spent 2 decades investigating cases like my uncle. Yes. And I learned something that keeps me awake at night. Alaska doesn't take people randomly. It's selective. It's intelligent. And it is patient. Some of you watching this right now will go to Alaska for work, for adventure, for research. And when you get there, Ella, remember these stories. You will remember the warnings. And in that moment when you encounter something impossible, something that makes every survival instinct scream danger, Ella, have a choice. Investigate or flee. I am begging you to choose flee, because Alaska has thousands of square miles where human bodies are never found. Where rescue operations are called off after 72 hours. Where the wilderness is so vast and so hostile that people simply cease to exist as if they never were. The Alaskan bush is still hungry. The empty plains still land. The radio still broadcasts names. The figures still gather at night. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, something ancient is still learning how we work. Still studying our patterns. Still perfecting its ability to make us walk barefoot into the night. Stay safe out there. Stay skeptical. Stay close to civilization. And most importantly, stay subscribed to Midnight Whispers stories. Remember, some wildernesses are empty for a reason. Some places are avoided for a reason. And some stories are told as warnings, not entertainment. I'll see you next week, if the wilderness lets us both survive that long. This is Midnight Whispers stories, reminding you that the darkest secrets aren't buried in graves. They re-walking through the Alaskan bush right now, looking for the next person curious enough to investigate. And they were very, very patient.